Hello there. Welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 1, Episode 12, Profit and Loss, Part 1, Profit. This is actually a two-part episode, so I'll be reviewing it as its own episode, but I'll also be covering Part 2, Loss, in this review. Both parts were written by Cannell and Huggins and directed by Lawrence Downey. This episode starts with an uncredited but fairly obvious voice cameo by Stuart Margolin on the Rockford answer phone.
This here's Tina Scarrett, remember me? From the army. I'm stuck here in town.
The actual episode begins with a threatening late-night phone call from businessman Leon Fielder.
You just get it done, or I'm going to cut off your water and leave you swinging in the breeze.
Played by Ned Beatty, a character actor with a credits list like a phone book, often playing the villain, and here it's no different, as he discusses the whereabouts of a particular employee, Alec Morris, who he suggests his colleague find. Meanwhile, Jim is trying to fix his garbage disposal when said Alec Morris turns up wanting to hire him.
Are you buying, selling, or collecting?
I'm hoping I might arrange for your services.
Clearly nervous, Morris explains that he wants Jim to act as a go-between for him and the feds, as he has some dangerous information, which obviously sets off alarm bells for Jim. Before Morris can explain his predicament, there's a knock at the door and Jim thinks it's Rocky. But instead it's two besuited goons who beat him up and grab Morris. Rocky eventually arrives after they've gone and thinks Jim has given himself an electric shock.
Look, I told you to stay away from that thing till I got here. You're supposed to turn the current off first.
There's a lovely interplay between the two in this scene that really sells their relationship, with Jim trying to save his father from not worry, but nagging. It's a situation I'm sure anyone can relate to, as I'm sure everyone has had a moment like this, and it's something this show does so well in introducing.
It was a disposal, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a disposal, Rocky. Give me a hand, wait.
Jim calls Becca and files a report on his assault and Morris's kidnapping. Then, the next day, he's approached by Helen Morris, who Jim doesn't recognise as Morris's wife because Alec Morris never gave Jim his name. But he did tell Helen to seek Jim out if anything happened to him. She explains her husband works in a computer department of Fiscal Dynamics Incorporated and wants Rockford to investigate, but he won't as it's an open case. This terrifies her as she's worried police involvement might spook the kidnappers, but Jim reassures her that that isn't the case.
That's a myth. Believe me, the police know how to handle these things better than you and me.
It's remarkable that the Rockford Files was able to debunk this detective show cliché in the mid-70s, and yet it would continue to be used in detective shows up until the present day, and I think it's another credit to the writing that they were willing to put an original spin on this well-worn trope. Later that same day, the cops are waiting to pick Jim up. He eventually finds out it's for filing a false police report, as Morris has returned and he and his wife deny that he was kidnapped. The DA plans to throw the book at Rockford, but luckily Beth is able to pull him out of the fire, temporarily at least.
Jim, we have a preliminary hearing on the 3rd. Wear a tie.
And this all gives him a reason to investigate a case that may or may not exist, but is causing him a headache. Once again, the writers have come up with an inventive but believable way to get Rockford involved with what should be a live police investigation. But not just that, this two-part episode is also really making use of the extra time it has. The additional scenes and the additional length of scenes all make it feel very believable and give us more time with Jim as a character. His bad luck and his dry wit on full display as he spars with everyone, from Rocky to the DA to Beth. His first action is to con his way into the Fiscal Dynamics building, and he heads immediately for Morris's office. He wants to have it out with Morris, but Morris informs him his office is bugged, so they head somewhere else, Rockford leaving a false trail for whoever's listening. Morris explains he's terrified for his life, but won't say any more, so Jim takes off, giving the goons the slip on his way, clearly none too happy.
Here, could you hold these just a minute, please?
Oh, he's on the 7th floor. Head him off by the staircase. Oh, come on. Let me give you a little hand here.
He comes home to a message from a Mrs. Parker, and when he goes to see her, we get another beautifully Rockford scene, as she's working on her race Ferrari with the help of her maid/mechanic, who also happens to be a chemical engineering student. There's no judgment or jokes from Jim, or no scenes of incredulity at a woman working on a car, and no attempt by the writers to go for any kind of cheap laugh. It's presented entirely casually, and I would go so far as to say it's progressive. Mrs. Parker firmly believes Fiscal Dynamics is up to something rotten, and wants to hire Jim to investigate her husband's death, as the late Mr. Parker used to do Morris's job before he died in an apparent traffic accident, which she thinks is murder. Rockford agrees and then meets with a financial analyst played by Michael Lerner, returning for the first time since playing a doctor in the pilot. He tells Rockford there is absolutely no impropriety with Fiscal Dynamics finances, and he continually recommends their stock to his clients, having been through the books himself. This scene was filmed at the then new Broadway Plaza, sadly no longer there, having been replaced by Macy's Plaza and now the Block. Yes, it was dark and brown like everything else in the 70s, but I happen to think it looks great and is a great location for the show to shoot at. We then cut to a printer's shop, where the printer is asking two Fiscal Dynamics goons for more money for the printing he does for them, on the machines he leased from them. Perhaps negotiating by showing a little too much of his hand.
I figured out what this printing is for. I mean, it took me a while, but I know what's going on.
Back at Rockford's trailer, he's approached by two different Fiscal Dynamic goons who insist Rockford meets with Leon Fielder. But these goons are a bit less goonish, so don't threaten Jim as much as arrange a meeting with him.
If you could come down to FDI, it would be a bit more convenient for Mr. Fielder.
Which is a refreshing change of pace to see Jim not get beaten up and hauled away. It seems that Michael Lerner's financial analyst has squealed to Fielder, and Fielder is pretty sore about it. Fielder threatens Rockford with a civil suit, as the investigation he's carrying out could start rumours the company isn't in the best of health, and Fielder can't have that happen to his stock. Meanwhile, the printer has clearly spooked Fiscal Dynamics, as two different goons turn up and murder him, making it look like a robbery. Sometime later, Mrs. Parker speaks with Jim and is not happy that he has been scared off investigating her case. And when she sees that the printer has been murdered, she recalls his name came up in a conversation with her husband about how a small business is being used by Fiscal Dynamics for all its printing, and is convinced there's some sort of connection. She eventually convinces him to accompany her, and he does a really bad job of cat burglary, which is where this episode ends. I really cannot praise this episode enough. It's really well paced with a great cast, has an intriguing mystery that unfolds in a natural and believable way, and it ends with a great cliffhanger. It uses the additional time it has to allow scenes to breathe a little without getting overly long, and doesn't rush any plot elements. It's a real masterclass in how you start two-part storytelling, and is easily a 5 out of 5 for me. But let's see if they can stick the landing in part 2, episode 13, Loss. Loss picks up right where we left off, with Jim having tripped the printer's shop alarm and the police on their way. He gets out, but not before the cops arrive, leading to a car chase with Mrs. Parker behind the wheel. Being a race car driver herself, she's perfectly suited to the task of running from the cops, and it's also a lot of fun to hear her criticise how crummy some parts of Rockford's car are compared with her Ferrari.
Lousy damn suspension.
You should get your shocks fixed. This thing's got a terrible understeer.
After they've shaken the cops, Rockford tells her that he couldn't find anything connecting the printers to fiscal dynamics, but theorises that if they did kill him, they took the files because he was printing phony stock certificates for them, artificially inflating the worth and prosperity of their company. Unfortunately, there's not much he can do at the moment, so Jim goes back to failing to fix his garbage disposal. Jim then pays a visit to his loose-lipped financial analyst, tricking him into giving up the name of an analyst who doesn't have a direct tie to fiscal dynamics.
Yeah, I talked to one of your competitors. He said you're a triple threat. Devious, dishonest, and unethical. Sure.
Yeah, well, if you believe anything that Norm Mitchell said, you gotta be crazy.
Norm Mitchell.
Mitchell has a much different opinion of the company, but isn't quite willing to believe Rockford's story about just how much trouble they're in. This doesn't stop some goons from tailing Jim as he leaves Mitchell's office, so he gives Mitchell a warning, which again Mitchell doesn't quite believe.
I'm not in any danger.
But I'll be careful. Thanks for the call.
Jim then calls the cops and reports his Tails car as stolen, and in perhaps the most unbelievable part of the story, the two goons following him get picked up almost immediately. Although perhaps car theft was treated more seriously in the 70s. Do let me know in the comments. Back at Rockford's trailer, we get our first appearance of friend and plumber for the Rockfords, LJ, who Rocky has managed to con into fixing the garbage disposal. But with all the heat on Rockford, he wants them both out of there as soon as possible. This heat is confirmed when he gets a call from a spooked Mitchell, who has been threatened by Fielder and is leaving town, and advises Jim to do the same. As Jim attempts to leave, he's being watched, and his car won't start, and he gets jumped moments later and taken to an empty house where he's threatened by a cigarette-smoking man, who threatens him with much more than a civil suit if he doesn't stay away from fiscal dynamics.
This is a fatal mistake. In this case, the word fatal can be taken both figuratively and literally.
While I understand the necessity for this scene to ramp up the danger and escalate the threat level, it does seem a little out of place, and introducing this new character at this stage makes it feel a little bit like it's padding. But it does help bring Rocky into the story properly and explains where Jim's missing gun had gone.
Did you take my gun out of the coffee jar?
Yeah, I was cleaning it 2 nights ago.
Rocky picks Jim up and they head to Fielder's house, where Jim sees his kidnapper exit, presumably with his payment, and follows him to the airport where he loses him, so goes back to Fielder's. This time it's Fielder's turn to leave with her bag, and so Jim follows him to the Fiscal Dynamics offices, where he exits with a second bag sometime later. Fielder spots Jim is following him, and a car chase ensues, with Jim finally cornering Fielder. Unfortunately, the less experienced Rocky allows Fielder to get the upper hand and Jim's gun. Jim eventually tries something that really doesn't pay off, but luckily for him, his gun was a bullet short. This puts a fire in Rocky to chase Fielder down, which really makes Jim happy.
I'm gonna catch that guy if it's the last thing I ever do.
And they and the cops finally catch up with Fielder, but he tries to talk his way out of it. Thankfully, by this point, Jim knows enough of what's going on to make sure that they're all taken in. And Jim has worked out where the missing bullet is.
It's in the garbage disposal.
For me, this second part isn't quite as strong as the first, as it rushes to reach the conclusion and throws in the added twist of the assassin threatening Rockford. I can't complain too much though, as it's not too much filler, and makes some sort of sense. Everything else though continues the high standard of the first part, as the various story elements dovetail together and wrap up. I don't know how radical the idea of large-scale corporate computer fraud was in the mid-70s, but having been through several financial disasters in my lifetime, it certainly feels very modern. Perhaps the most unrealistic aspect being that the people responsible for these corporate crimes looks as if they're going to be punished. This is yet another episode of the show that takes it in a different direction, with a different type of mystery to investigate, while remaining within the realms of possibility. It's remarkable just how good the Rockford Files is at giving us such a variety of crimes and mysteries for Jims to solve. This part and the overall story is easily a 5 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.